All right, guys, welcome to today's class. The first thing I want to ask is, how many of you all have been able to um, well, not review last week's class, but review the content for this class?
Partially.
Okay, I know it was long,
Yeah.
but you got a chance to look at things, listen to the presentation at all? So I take it Mr. Walker is the only person.
So I was watching the lecture video.
Right. You missed the first class.
No.
So why were you looking at the lecture video?
I have no idea. I just saw this, so I said, okay, let me watch it.
Okay, you just having Jones. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So we're gonna get started by looking at the presentation for the idea really is for you guys to kind of go through the presentations that are already on the system. For us to have a deeper discussion about the content that we have in it, so that we could bring deeper understanding. Each chapter, well, this presentation is going to deal with the course outline, the preface, and chapter 1, and we're going to be looking at sort of like the foundation for that whole concept that we're going to be looking at there. So I guess without further ado, let me all right, I'm going to have to turn this camera off and start presenting. So I expect, and I'm not going to be able to see you guys when I have the full screen on. So if you all want to if you all want to ask questions and that kind of stuff, feel free to just chime in and ask. Just turn on, ask questions, make comments. I will be asking questions. So you all seeing this?
Yes, sir.
Right.
Yes,
So
sir.
you all get the opportunity to go through this, slowly. So I'm gonna pause and look at certain elements of it with you to try and I want somebody to give me about an hour for us to take a break. I'm hoping I get to a certain page and I'll know that we will be taking a bit of a break along the way. All right. So first thing, in terms of the course description, the first thing I wanted to point out to you guys was that the nature of this course is not meant to be what's the word I want to use? Expansive, in-depth course. It's an introductory course into leadership, and those in-depth though is going to be fairly heavy, and is going to require you to put in a lot of effort from your part. So it's going to be focused on our shared experience with leadership, via your self-analysis and via your reflections on the situations that you found yourself in where you've experienced leadership. So you'd realize there's a lot of personal activities that are in the course. So for example, Ms. Ramata, for example, have you gone through the assessments required for the class? Ms. Ramata?
Yes.
You understand what you need to be doing, right?
What's that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
There was one question that you should have answered already, which you could probably answer by today, which would be in the reflections and leadership plan. There's a question about your expectations for the course before it starts. You should probably try and write that up. Speaking of which, how many of you guys wrote up that a response to that question already? All of you all should have done it, and I'm hoping that you guys are proactive enough to have done something like that. Yes?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So newcomers will have to organize their stories in relation to that. So so you see the last one here, application of the tools of leadership, ethical decision making, and good governance. So we're going to be looking at this as well with particular exercises that are going to go on in the classroom as well. So, learning outcomes here, we're looking at understanding the various theories of leadership, apply defend decisions using ethical decision-making tools, create a plan. That's one of your assignments. Create a plan that applies the concepts of good governance to your thing. Organize teams. Well, we already started to work on that. So teamwork is going to be part of the thing. Report on leadership issues facing our communities and society and propose solutions. So that's part of the discussion that we're going to be getting into. And this one here, probably the most important, display and modify behaviors indicative of a personal philosophy of positive leadership and ethics. Now, the question that comes to mind here is, now a lot of you in this class are students of social work and psych, right? If I remember.
Kinda, yeah.
Kinda. Social work, psych, and sociology. All right. So behavior modification is one of those high areas of study in terms of behavior. How do you, or what experience do you have with behavior modification? And it's a little unfair. We didn't ask Miss Ramata what program she does. Ramata, you might answer that question.
Yeah, I'm doing the BSc in MLT, Medical Lab Technology.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Since you're speaking, what do you think behavior modification entails?
No idea.
Right there. All right. Anybody wants to speak to her about behavior modification? But are you, Ms. Ramata, are you a married woman? Do you have children?
Yes. Yes to both questions.
Yes to both. So you know that you do engage in behavior modification, and you probably don't know it. How old are
Probably,
your
yeah, I think.
How old are your kids?
Oh, my son, he'll be 2 soon.
All right. So
Yeah.
when they engage in things that you don't like, when they do things that you don't like, what do you do?
You try to correct them or
How do you correct them? What methods do you use for correction?
or
All right, so let me ask it more from a historic point of view, and other people could chime in here. In the past, when you were corrected, how were you corrected? What were the techniques?
Don't run again.
Sorry?
To belt. Do not do that again.
That say that. I'm not quite understanding what you mean by that.
You would get licks.
Right, physical punishment, right? So it was supposed to do what? Stimulate you to be able to modify your behavior so that you would act in a manner according to what was approved by your parents or your guardians at that point in time. Would other people agree with that?
Yes, sir. What I was going to say, and where I work, we call it the retributive style. Or rehabilitation. So the rehabilitation is the behavior modification.
Right.
And the retributive is the old way of style, the old style of pain and punishment.
Right. So you have different techniques, and obviously, hello, Mr. Manswell. Obviously, what has taken place is that over time, the techniques of behavior modification have changed. So you find in the old days, basically, it was punishment, and of course reward, because that's something else parents utilize. We say, okay, if you do good things, then good things will come your way. So you get treats and desserts and stuff as a child growing up. But if you don't do things that are approved and are good for you, then or what people want you to do, your behavior is not reinforced. That makes sense. So behavior model. Do you think that we can at Costat engage in punishment and that type of stuff to get you to modify your behavior when it comes to leadership? Does that make sense? Guys, I told you already, this is, you all have to contribute in the class. It's not a sit back and wait for me to come across, because a lot of this class is about your perception of things. So coming back to the question at hand, do you think that I can use punishment or ought to be using punishment? And would punishment make your behavior stick? What's your ideas on that?
So like plagiarism, you could get expelled from school like that.
Right, so that's good. So plagiarism, generally, before you get to the point of expulsion, what happens?
Maybe you fail that
Or you-
assignment.
yeah, or you get an opportunity to fix the assignment to encourage you to do it right. That's correct. You ever had lecturers who give you a paper back and say, listen, you need to fix this because there's too many errors with your citation?
So doesn't it depend on the lecturer or the student?
Uh, Technically, it's not supposed to. They're supposed to be, when it comes to plagiarism, it should be consistent behavior across all classes. But you're right, some lecturers don't consider plagiarism or citation an important element of the assignment. And of course, that then transcends to how students respond to the assignments and the whole concept of plagiarization.
Mhm.
So, and this is what happens in households, for example, where there isn't a consistency of effort in discipline for children. When you have one parent who's trying to insist on one type of behavior and therefore is utilizing various forms of punishment or rewards to be able to modify that behavior, but somebody else is allowing that same behavior and not doing anything about it and probably even encouraging it, then you get something occurring in the individual called cognitive dissonance, which causes problems, and we'll come across that term a few times when it becomes even more problematic. And in fact, children learn quite easily and quite quickly which parent they need to go to when they want to get something that they know they're not supposed to get. Isn't that right, people?
Very true.
Yes, sir.
So you know which person is the easy touch and which person, and eventually, if the parents know themselves well, they will start making the statement, ask your mother or ask your father, that kind of stuff. So they know, okay, they are pushover, that's why they're coming to you first. And then you basically have to recognize that you have limitations in terms of the ability to instill that form of discipline, and therefore you're going to be making the statement, ask your mother, that kind of thing. So again, but that's a good thing, because it means that at least that person has recognized the fact that they have that particular weakness. But in some households, you don't have that situation. How many people here have children that they're raising and they get problems when there is a dichotomy of positions when it comes, that especially happens between mothers and not stepmothers, but mother-in-laws, especially when it comes to raising children. There's a whole set of nonsense that goes on with that dynamic, that grandparents and will allow certain behaviors that parents would say, listen, we're trying not to do this, and this is not what's supposed to happen, and you have to support me with this. And then you have this double standards taking place that then leads to a fair amount of confusion in relation to the behavior of children. So that's something that you want to do. So no, we can't beat you. Let's put it that way. We have to inspire you or stimulate you from from internally. So internal motivation is what we're going to be trying to work with to get you to modify your behavior to begin to display or want to display better leadership qualities. And that's the nature of this course. Now, it's not likely that this is going to happen um, immediately, because this type of behavior modification is something that will take time, because here you are trying to change behaviors that have become embedded in your belief structure for a long period of time. All right. Okay, so let's move along here. Remember, we talked about the textbooks that we're using. So we have the main text, because we're going to be looking at lots of work from this. In fact, this chapter that we're looking at comes from this textbook, The Exploring Leadership. And then we're going to be doing a couple of chapters out of the Leadership Experience by Dath. Stick with these that I have on the system for you guys, because as the new editions came up, there were some modifications to the layout and the treatment of it. So you want to be careful if you have a newer version of the book that the chapters correlate to the older one. All right, so be careful with that if you're using them. But this is the textbook that we're using, and you'll notice that I'm going to stay very close to the text because I'm looking at what the model coming from these chapters is trying to explain to us, and working with that. All right, so unit 1 of the book is titled Leadership in the Modern World, an Introduction. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at the concept of how leadership has been perceived in the 21st century. And one of the big things that challenges that came up in the early part of the 21st century is the whole question of leaders being born or being made. And that's still up for grabs, because a lot of people still believe, if for those of you who have done psych and soc, you should have come across the nurture versus nature argument in terms of the development of humans, and how we become the way we are. And as a result of that, what you find happening is that a similar kind of ideology comes across with leadership. You're either born to be a leader or you're not. That's the concept of some people. And in fact, some people still perceive leadership as something of a family trait that can be passed down from one person. We refer to it as great man theory and stuff like that. We'll look at that in a little more details in the following chapters. So therefore, what we are going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at the development of this concept and the whole idea of leadership and its development. And we're going to try to utilize the model that we're looking at to look at our experience here in the Caribbean region, in particular in Trinidad. We will, by the nature of the course, begin to examine our leaders right around us, both in our local experience. We hopefully will get to look at some regional, and of course international will be easy to find as well. So those are things that the chapter and the text wants us to approach in terms of it. So it starts by defining what the model here is leadership. And leadership is defined as a relational and ethical process of people together attempting to accomplish positive change. And the main takeout from that is leadership is about relationships. Now, a lot of people perceive leadership as independent to relationships, and that is a mistake, because the only way you can get anything done in any circumstance is you have to depend on the people around you to get things done. So therefore, it's dependent upon the relationship you've been able to develop with the individuals around you who make up part of the team or the organization that you're working with, or the family that you're working with. And of course, we're talking about the nature of that relationship and the ethical process that you utilize in that relationship. So we're going to be spending a lot of time evaluating the nature of the relationship, the ethical boundaries that govern that, and then the whole system of how we work together to get things done. And you notice that it shapes it down to positive change, because we can get together to do negative things as well. I mean, you think about it. How did many of you learn to swear?
You mean like curse and all that?
Yeah, swearing.
By
Movies.
hearing it?
By hearing it.
Yeah.
From whom?
Neighbors, siblings, TV,
Right.
music,
Friends.
friends.
Yeah. So one of the first things you may have learned in school was not necessarily your ABCs and stuff like that, but more about how to cost people. Right? All right. So one of the things, understand therefore that when we get together, we don't only get together to do positive things. We sometimes get together and we do negative things, and that goes without saying, because there's a lot of people out there who have in the past done things that are very, very negative in the nature of how things are done. All right, and we'll get to see that in a bit. All right, so how do we define leadership in various contexts? So leadership is seen through different frames. So the first frame we're looking at is through political science. And when we talk about political or politics, what we're talking about is how I gather power and how I use that power to influence others. So that's something that there's a whole chapter on that one team has to present on power and influence. So what you're talking about is political. So when we think about that, we think about people like this. Well, this is a bit old, as I said. This is Trump, and this is the Chinese president or prime minister, as the case might be. These are leaders from very powerful. So they're very powerful individuals. Somebody has a question, or somebody just came in?
Yes, I was just on here coming late because my Wi-Fi had cut.
Right. Okay. Cool. No problem. Let me just take a note of that, Rajnath Singh. Anybody else snuck in while I was
Me, sir. Chivon.
Mansing? All right.
Manswell.
Manswell. Right. No, I thought you when you came in.
All right.
All right. Okay, so back to the presentation. So we're looking at individuals who are powerful, and they arrive. Well, the reason why I chose this photo is because of the way in which each of these individuals arrives into power. Now, here we're not talking about the individuals themselves, but the office that they hold. So the American system utilizes a system of democracy where people are basically voted into office through popular decree. But in the Chinese system, it is a system of the party selecting somebody to become leader of the country for a period of time. But of course, they do a lot of in-house politicking and trying to get the support of the various elements of the party to support their ideas and their concepts. All right. So that is two individuals, and most importantly, what's happening here? We're talking about two of the number one and two countries that economic powerhouses in the world at this point in time, that are obviously in a struggle for dominance in the world geopolitical spheres. And that's something that other countries look on, basically because when giants are fighting, we have to rock back and wait for them to decide what they're doing, right? This is another dichotomy of relationships here. This again represents one world that is represented as a free world, and another world that is represented by it being a very closed and undemocratic state. Now, as opposed to China, anybody? Well, first off, you all recognize this Asian-looking gentleman here, yes?
Jong-un?
Yep.
North Korea.
North Korea. He's the premier of North Korea, and he, well, their system is very weird because he became the premier or the prime minister or the leader of that country upon the death of his father, because it's the way it works is that he is ordained by God to be the leader of North Korea. You all need to look into the history of how that occurred, but it's sort of like, you're born. This is the idea of a born leader, and this guy is supposed to represent the idea that leaders can be made, and literally, it's kind of like chalk and cheese. But whole situation we're looking at here is, if anybody's familiar with the way of life in North Korea, you realize that people of North Korea basically have very little that they can do, and very little that they have, while the persons who are in positions of power have everything. So look into it and you see what happens. Similarly, in the United States, people with money and power are able to develop much better lifestyles than those people who have very little. But the idea is that you're still free to be able to try and get that piece of that pie that everybody has. This is another group of individuals here that represent another set of leaders throughout throughout the world. This is the G7 summit in 2019. Anybody recognize some of these leaders besides Mr. Trump? Who else do you all see that you might is recognizable to you?
President Trudeau.
Who's that? President Trudeau?
I think Macron,
Yeah, which one is Macron?
the third one to the right. Well,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think the German president or prime minister, whichever she is.
This one here? Which prime
No,
minister?
to the left. She, yeah,
Of what country?
Germany.
Right, Angela Merkel. So this, as I said, this is pretty old because this prime minister is no longer in place anymore. This is the English prime minister at the time. The current English prime minister is Boris Johnson, right? Yes. You all know that guy. He came in on the Brexit ticket. This guy is the prime minister of Japan. I think this guy is I think this guy is Spain, represents Spain. This is Canada, Germany, United States, UK. I think this is just one of the dignitaries that signed on the document. Macron here. I think Italy is also represented here, and I can't quite remember everybody. Their flags are behind there, so if you can recognize them, will be fine. Sweden, I think, is part of that whole group as well. But again, this represents political power, and these people have or are in control or wield such large economic power that it determines, in a lot of instances, the livelihood of millions of people, and how they behave determines a lot of what takes place in those countries, and the decisions that they make. So this summit here, they were dealing with the I think it was the Kyoto Convention. In fact, that during this meeting, Trump had actually removed himself from signing this document there in terms of the Kyoto Convention, I believe, was that, and we'll see something following up with that as well. So another framework under which we could look at leadership and how it's defined is through the lenses of management, and specifically management looks at getting the best out of the resources that you have available. So it's looking at effectiveness of outcomes based upon the relationship between supervisors and subordinates. So in essence, what you're looking for there at the end of the day is profitability. So the only way that a company is measured as being successful is those that make the most amount of profit. So if you think about this gentleman here, for example, anybody's familiar with him? He's dead now,
Steve Jobs.
right? Steve Jobs. Not necessarily a legendary leader, innovative, is responsible for a lot of the things that we take for granted now, um, as being possible. Because I remember the first time iPhones or smartphones started to come into the market, his was probably by far still is one of the leading phones in the world, and the technology was just so smooth. And but he was not a nice person to work with because his focus was on getting the best possible product out to his customers, but at the expense of how the relationship that he developed with his employees. So much so that he's been rumored to have fired people by from his own company by calling the helpline and asking questions, and when they were unable to assist, they he drove to the he went to the police and then just had them fired. So very kind of what do you call it? Visionary guy, but no people skills. Anybody saw the film about him? If you followed the film,
No,
you
sir.
realize that he had a very estranged relationship. You should look at the film if you get a chance. That depicts the life of Steve Jobs. You should look at that. This gentleman here, anybody ever looked at social networking? Or the social network? This is the gentleman who is responsible for Facebook. This is a much cooler picture of um, this gentleman, and it's interesting that he is still in the hot seat these days because of the way in which Facebook has come under a lot of pressure as a result of the way in which information is being utilized and shared in the system. So again, the people who use his product don't know what's happening with the information that they have. That what they do online is sold as a product to other companies so that they can market to you. And then if they're selling that information to make money, because I mean, you don't pay to use Facebook, but obviously something is happening if Facebook is such a blue chip company, it's making so much money. It can't be because everybody is giving it likes. It don't work that way. So somehow or the other, what they were able to do was to work out a way to monetize the system. And that system of selling data and selling information and giving access to advertisers to be able to access you. So you'd realize that whatever you do online, suddenly you start to get, and Google is also part of this whole thing as well. Whatever you do online, you start to get similar goods and adverts coming to you. How many of you here shop on Amazon or on eBay?
I do Amazon.
Right. So do you notice when you buy certain things, then suddenly you start to get mail about similar items coming in to you, asking if you're interested in this and that kind of stuff?
No, sir, because I have a fine print where you could actually enable it or disable it
No.
when you read the policies.
Right. So when you go down and you turn it off,
Yeah.
you disable that aspect of the sale of your information. But do you still find that when you go to browse for items, anything, you find things populating on the page in front of you when you're doing your searches?
Not exactly, to be honest.
So to be honest with you, even though you clicked off of the content information, sharing your content, because I did the same thing, you're still going to end up getting prompts and adverts coming your way in one way or the other, like pop-ups and stuff like that on your screens. Of course, if you have a VPN, then that will help to protect against that element. But these guys are in a hot seat right now about data and information selling. The bad thing about it is that so many people are just totally unaware of what's happening and how much monitoring is taking place. just speaking of Amazon, so he's also one of these individuals who I think he's now the richest guy in the world. I guess during the pandemic, his business sort of like became the go-to place for people to buy things, and because they were stuck home. So what do you do when you're home? You shop. And he got online shopping, but of course, a lot of people found that the way in which he treats his employees and the people who work for him, the smallest people around him, was very bad, and a lot of people. Um, so now he's sort of, I guess, left Amazon, and he's now going to be taking spaceships. So another spaceship person, him and the guy from Virgin, similar type of ideas. All right, so another framework that we can look at leadership through is anthropology. So anybody here is so students or psych student may have done some anthropological studies. No? So when we talk about anthropology, what we're looking at is we're trying to look at the history of us as people by evaluating those things that we get from our history that can tell us something about the way in which we live. So that's why they reflect on cultural influences, the symbols that represent us, and the norms and behaviors that we get up to. So, what can we think of that comes to mind when we talk about that? Well, if you look at the symbol that represents the anthropological society, one of the things or a couple of things that they look at is when we think of anthropology, we think, digging up bones and that kind of stuff. So that goes without saying, because that's where we unearth a lot of understanding about how a village works, or how a place works, or society works, by looking at the remnants of what's left behind. This symbol here, or this element of symbol here, reflects the artifacts and tools that the society would have used. And this here would look at the language that was utilized by the organization. And then, of course, the society that was developed, which then speaks to our culture. So if we use anthropology to look at a modern society, relatively modern society in the world, if we were gathering information about that, what would we replace besides the bones that would be left back from our society of ourselves, or our physical beings that would remain behind? What tool do you think would replace this stone, this stone carving here, this arrowhead or axe head? What might you see here instead? That would be representative of
A fatback computer.
what?
A fatback computer.
Yeah. I think what we would see here is a smartphone. I would think that there is a smartphone. Over here, we might see people sitting at a distance from each other looking at a smartphone, and the language that we will be speaking is all digital binary language. You're following? But what would leadership be like in a society, in our society today? How do people arrive at leadership roles? And I'm not talking about political, but basically become influential individuals in our society, in especially our online society. No, don't know. Likes? Does that sound familiar? How much likes did you get when you become an influencer? You're following what I'm talking about there? Anybody? You don't have to agree with me, but I'm just telling you, in terms of my perception, I would see the tool that comes here would be a handheld smartphone device. This will stay constant because, I mean, until we become totally different, that thing. Over here will be ones and zeros because that'll be the language that we're communicating with. And the picture of our society or culture will be of individuals sitting or standing, staring at little tablets and phones all over the place, but not actually interacting with each other. That's unfortunate. That's the way I envision our thing. And the way in which somebody becomes a leader in that environment is by the number of likes that they get for what they've done. And that leads to a lot of outrageous behaviors. But again, archaeology and anthropology try to look at the way in which our societies were developed. So if we go backwards in time a little bit, you'd start to realize culturally, leadership. That's why we start with the whole situation. That the only way you could have arrived in a position of leadership was because you had to be born into it. So if you think about leaders were derived by lineage. You had to be born a king, and then you had to marry another queen or king and that kind of stuff to keep the bloodline pure. That type of stuff. You're following what I'm talking about. If any of you all are history buffs would like to look at movies from the past, and you look at that king and queen and stuff like that, all of that had to do with in terms of the bloodline that you kept, and you had to keep the blood pure and that type of stuff. So that type of attitude is one of the things that we've inherited in our past in terms of the emergence of our ideas about leadership. So these are other diagrams that anthropology looks at that represent similar things. It's just a different way of looking at the whole circumstance of how anthropology approaches the study of leadership and the study of society. So another way in which we can look at leadership is through history. And when there have been major events taking place in the history of humans, there have been key people who rose to the top and became leaders in those systems. So this one is related, these four gentlemen are related to an event called the Great War, or what we now know as the Second World War. Everybody recognizes these four individuals?
Yeah.
All right, can you tell me who they are?
Hitler, Stalin, can't remember the other two names, to be honest.
Just imagine, you remember the most evil of the two, of the four.
Churchill.
Churchill.
Yeah, that was his name, Churchill.
Carry hat. And
As soon as he won from America.
right, well, who was he? You know, other people can assist you. He doesn't have to know everything. So Roosevelt.
Yeah.
So you understand why now we have a highway called the Churchill Roosevelt Highway?
I have no idea why, to be honest.
Well, because the highway was named after these two gentlemen who were the main proponents of the Allied forces that fought against Germany in particular, and then, well, eventually Stalin. But Stalin actually wasn't part of the situation with Germany. Yeah? Who's Stalin? How did Stalin come to... What country did Stalin lead?
Soviet Union.
Right. And Russia at the time, right? So the Soviet Union came up after the fact, but it developed out of what Stalin did. But initially, Stalin was an ally to these guys. But after the war, they didn't trust communism and ended up marginalizing him, which then led to the development of the Cold War. So along the way, they were able to annihilate Hitler. But he was sort of the genesis to the Cold War that came up in the 50s after the end of the World War. So things like that to look at. So these guys rose to prominence at various times due to the events surrounding World War II. What about this gentleman? Who's he?
Martin Luther King Jr.
Right? And what movement did he represent? Or he rose to prominence in?
And he was running for president of the United States before he was assassinated.
No. Anybody wants to help him out?
Empowering black people.
All right, but what was the movement that he was involved in? We have a version of the movement that exists today called the Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, Black Panthers.
Nah, he was.
And he was for civil rights or something like that?
Right.
All right.
He was part of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, but the Black Panthers was he like a kind of part of that too, you know?
Yes, I know they were. And in fact, that's where this person comes in. Everybody recognizes this gentleman.
Yep. Dr. Eric Williams' partner.
Who's that? That's a vague statement. His name is right up at the back there, though. All right, Stokely Carmichael. But what was his name after a while? He changed his name in the 60s. Anybody knows his African name?
Kwame Ture.
Yes, there you go. And he was actually instrumental in bringing the Black Power movement to Trinidad, which led to the Black Power revolution in the 1970s here in Trinidad and Tobago. That's why, as I said, the activities in one country begins to influence the activities in other countries, and that actually resulted in a massive change in the way in which Trinidad was actually managed by Dr. Eric Williams when the 1970s revolution came, because he realized that he couldn't keep the status quo back at that point in time, where for those of you who may not be familiar with the history of Trinidad and Tobago, at least from that period, that a lot of society was closed off to regular Trinidadians. And when I say regular Trinidadians, there are certain jobs and areas of Trinidad that were reserved for white and pseudo-white individuals. You all are familiar with a place called Country Club? You don't hear about it much anymore. You all familiar with a place called Country Club? Anybody?
Yeah.
It's still
It's
around.
not in
I
Marvel.
know it's still around, but it's just not
In Marvel, correct.
Marvel.
Yeah.
You all know about Mocha Heights?
Yeah.
All right, just have a good fete there every year for Carnival. Well, they used to be when we had Carnival going. But you understand what I'm talking about. There were certain jobs, for example, you couldn't work at a bank if you weren't white or near white. And that meant that people who were not white could not access jobs and wealth, and therefore they were kept away from owning property and therefore developing themselves. In fact, there were laws that restricted that type of ownership and movement of people. And this gentleman here was one of many who came into the West Indies and brought back the ideology of the civil rights movement coming out of the United States, and brought that concept of the liberalization and strengthening of the individuals of primarily what they refer to as the black race or the African race in Trinidad and Tobago. But it transcends more than just that. It transcends into basically shaking up the status quo. Has it changed much? Well, you guys be the judge. We live in a society now that is governed a lot not by the value of individuals, but what's happening in their wallet. So I don't know, have things really changed? Or what about this gentleman here? His battle was even more clear cut. Anybody knows the social movement that he sort of was able to undo. You all recognize this guy?
Mandela.
Yes, Nelson Mandela. What was he synonymously associated with? First, he was the first black president of South Africa. All right, but what existed before was a system called apartheid, in which you had a white-only rule. So he was able to dismantle that entire system through popular movement. But I mean, for him to get to that position, he suffered a lot. All right, all right. So that's from historical positions. Um, Another area that we're going to be looking a lot of, borrowing a lot from, is psychology and sociology. Psych looks at the individual, sociology looks at how groups behave and interact. So I want to bring this picture up and ask the question of which leader would you like to be working with? The one on the right or the one on the left?
The right.
Right.
Why the right?
Right.
Because he's leading by example and helping everyone as a team.
Right? As opposed to, that's how you feel. Anybody agrees with that?
Yes, I second that.
Yeah. So why not the boss on the left?
Because he's kind of making his employees carry the business and carry him, being a little more authoritarian.
All right. So let me ask the other question. Which type of leader do you know exists in more, it is more the majority behavior?
The
The
boss.
left.
The left.
The left or the right?
Left.
All right. So the boss, not the leader, the boss. So that then begs the question, what type of leader do you want to be? If you were able to get into positions of leadership, what type of leader would you prefer to be? You don't have to answer. You'd probably want to be on the left. But remember, at the end of the day, if we only focus on what the goal is and achieving the goal, then we could say both organizations are successful. But how we get to that successful position is what the theories that we're going to be looking at, is what the concern of this model or this thing is going to be about. All right, so that brings us to these three individuals here. Anybody recognizes at least two of them? That this guy is easy. His name is Sigmund Freud. His name is right there. What is he famous for, infamous for? Anybody?
Conditional. Well, he's a psychologist or something like that.
Yeah. What is he famous for?
The conditional theories.
What do you mean by conditional theories?
That would be like. I'm not sure I'll go back to that one.
Anybody wants to help him? All right. So Sigmund Freud was very important in understanding or developing the use of something called psychotherapy, where instead of treating people with psychosis, what they call a psychiatric issue, instead of treating them with drugs and shock treatment, they utilized instead a system of therapeutic treatment through discourse and discussion, and what we now know as, you lay on the bench and you start to talk about. I mean, he did develop things about the id and the super id and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that he developed as well in his psychoanalysis. But he's infamous or famous for that particular development in psychiatry in terms of treatments. But of course, he also is known for the Oedipus complex and that type of stuff as well. So those are things that you may want to look into. The gentleman in the middle is Karl Marx. What is he famous or infamous for? He was actually a socialist who's not a socialist. He was a sociology person and an anthropology individual, and he developed the manifesto for communism, which is also developed into socialism, and that is a methodology that he had developed for how to run societies and how societies could be looked at and developed on a more even scale. Of course, his concepts and ideas were kind of, what's the word I want to use? Um, Taken by leaders like Stalin, because that's actually where it took place, and corrupted to meet their own particular beliefs. Whereas the concept and idea was that people as a whole work together for the benefit of everybody. That's at the end of the day, that was going to be the most important aspect. The gentleman on the far right of your screen there is a gentleman called B.F. Skinner. Anybody is familiar or heard about that before? Thinking of people who did social psych, or anybody who might have done education studies. B.F. Skinner is most well known for his development of andragogy, which is the study of how education systems have been adapted and developed for specifically educating adults. So between the three of these gentlemen, they all form the main school for behavioral sciences, and we are going to be utilizing in the development of the program of studies that we're going to be looking at here with this theory. We're going to be dependent a lot on the behaviorist type approach. Now, we'll get more details into that approach later on when we look at chapter 3 or chapter 2, when we look at behaviorals and the background to the theory that we're going to be looking at so far. All right. So, question: how does your field look at leadership? Now, this could be your field of study or where you currently work. How do you think they treat with that area of leadership? So this is something that you need to be able to respond to. So, we have any graphic artists here in class, or we have some MLT people, I think. How's leadership determined or dealt with in that field? Well, don't all jump in now. Jamal, what about you? What field are you in?
I am web design, so I build websites.
Right. So that's what is the leadership design in your field?
Well, the leadership design would be more like a leader than a boss, because when you don't know something, you could go to the leader and find out. Because if you don't know something, then the website won't go up, and you'll have problems. So,
okay, but do you expect that the leader will know everything?
no, but the leader will impart the knowledge that they do know.
Right. Okay. Very good. Anybody else? Archer Royer.
Yes, sir.
What area do you work in?
In HR.
Sorry?
In HR.
Okay, for some reason I'm not hearing you well.
Are you hearing me now?
I mean, you're a little better there now. What were you saying now? What area do you work in?
Human resources.
Human right. Okay, that's a wonderful area, because how is leadership treated with there in that field? How do people arrive at positions of leadership there?
I could say that HR. You all don't know what company I work for, so I would say that is popularity.
Sorry?
Where I work, I would say is popularity.
popularity. Okay. So what's wrong with popularity?
It should not be that way, but that's how it is where I am.
All right. So how do you think it ought to be?
I think it should be based on people's educational experience.
A combination of their education and experience. Okay. Does the combination of their education and experience speak to their ability to influence others?
I think maybe the experience would.
You think maybe the experience would. All right. So you're saying right now that the persons in your organization or the system that works in your organization has to do with relative popularity. Is it that people are hired generally without qualifications, or do they have to come in with some basic set of information?
I think I could get myself in trouble for answering some of these questions.
No, but it's important how your perception is shaped, because I'm thinking most organizations have a baseline upon which they hire people, right?
Definitely. But you see, the thing is, well, I am in HR, so I know exactly what happens and what people are hired off of, if they have qualifications or not.
Right.
That's why I'm choosing to stay silent.
All right. So you prefer not to say the organization you're working for, and I respect that, because I know you don't sell them out, and that's nice. But you're saying therefore that the positions of power management and is dependent upon people's popularity. Is it popularity with the general staff, or is it popularity with particular groups or individuals in the organization who hold the power?
The ones that hold the power, definitely.
So that's not necessarily popularity. That's about ingratiating themselves with those individuals and basically, all right, that piece of thing. So yeah, I understand that's something that's different. So it's not about popularity. It's about their willingness to play the game, to appeal to the persons who dispense power. But that, of course, is fleeting, because your approval with them is not a consistent type of thing. Yeah, remember that, huh?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, look, Derek had put in for one of the pictures the Canadian Prime Minister. That was a picture with the President of Europe, right? That's correct. Japanese Prime Minister, German Chancellor, Italian. Interesting. British Prime Minister. Well, Boris Johnson, the person who was there was me, I think, in that picture. Emmanuel Macron, Justin Trudeau. Good stuff there. All right. Anybody else is willing to examine that question of how your field of study approaches leadership studies or leadership in general? Mr. Walcott, you want to chime in here and speak in a general format?
Well, my field of study, in line with my work environment, is a top-down leadership model.
Right. That is true.
Top-down
leadership is you do as your leaders say. But how do
you follow instructions?
Yeah. But how do people traverse or become leaders in that model?
Well, at present, it's a matter of qualifications and passing the relevant promotional examinations.
Right. And generally, people get to be able to access those examinations after years have passed in their service.
Right now, to change it, as your probationary period finishes, you're eligible to write the exams. You're only able to write the promotional exams up until a particular rank.
Right.
And from there, it's a matter of qualification and assessment with experience and interview panel, and that's how you move up. In some instances, it's political friends and favor.
True. And you find that happens.
It's still a top-down thing.
Still, yes, so good. And that is, so it is a system in which what the leader says goes. So it's not a participative system. It's one that and that is so because of the military nature of the way in which that organization.
The paramilitary.
Yeah.
Not full military power.
Right. So that background, that military background, gives it that type of shape. It doesn't necessarily mean that it works well.
True that.
It doesn't necessarily work well, and there are alternative methodologies that can be utilized. But is the service willing to examine those? I don't think so, because the service has.
Well, I would say, I wouldn't even say 50-50. I would say more like 40-60 hesitancy. It depends on who in charge.
Right. But what happens
they
is
might push some things and some things they might not push.
right. And what I found is that they become entrenched in what the legal statements say, or what the regulations state, and don't realize that regulations are there based upon systems that have existed in the past, but they're not necessarily relevant in today's environment.
Well, I like presently the present person in charge. He, in some ways, tried to modify some of the areas,
right?
But bring it up to mark with presently management styles and techniques,
right?
But we still have the old colonialist guidelines and regulations that need upgrading, and nobody seems to want to interfere with that.
Well, and that's what I'm talking about, because a lot of people who hark back to, it used to work in the past, why isn't it working now, is because the circumstances under which you're operating then to now is different. The type of criminal that you're dealing with, the type of circumstances that you're faced with goes beyond the capacity of the situations that those things were designed to deal with. And in fact, the focus of the police force back then was not necessarily to solve crime and that kind of stuff. It's just to keep people in line.
True.
All right. So the genesis of that system was to really keep people in line with what the moneyed classes want to happen. So which is why to this day people with money are treated differently by the authorities than people without money. And it just goes to show that the system is sort of built that way. We don't necessarily agree with the way it's built, but it's traditionally worked that way. But that is being challenged, or has been challenged, but hasn't really changed much. I don't think so.
But Mr. Bisu, just a backtrack a bit. When you show the image of the World War II leaders,
yeah,
a question came to the fore of my mind that isn't okay, even though Hitler and them was back in 18 or 1940, whatever it was. Me personally assessing the present modern day environment that we live in, this pandemic era. Is it that there's some resemblance of what took place that then taking place now? That's a question.
Well, how you tell me how you're seeing the parallels.
Okay, for example, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. What the Nazis did, they were actually going around stamping the Jews and saying Jews and non-Jews. They were actually stamping a Jews, a J, in the people ID book for card or whatever. So when the Gestapo went around checking the people certification, they would see a J saying that you are Jew. So nowadays, the present day thing is they're looking for the ID card to say vax or unvaccinated.
Yeah.
I
wouldn't like to bring that. I wouldn't want to make that direct comparison, but it can be made. Yes, you're right. In terms of how that system of eugenics worked, and if you understand the concept of what eugenics is about, it's a very old system, but a lot of people are fearful that is what is at play at this point in time.
And to take it a step further, I just say eugenics. In eugenics, ushered in also the apartheid era in South Africa.
That's what actually is all one and the same. It was part of that whole process. Race is actually a invented concept that was supported from eugenics in any case.
Yeah.
because there is no distinction in individuals. Well, let's put it this way: races are just classifications that was created by somebody who wanted to classify things. All right, because technically there's no significant difference between somebody who is classified as a Caucasian as opposed to somebody who might be classified as a Mongolian. There's very limited differences. The only reason why differences existed was because of environmental circumstances. So the
Correct.
texture of your skin and your hair and the color of your skin and your hair in particular, and your eyes and stuff like that was based upon more things about the climatic conditions under which you live, the types of food that you ate, which led to certain types of deficiencies, which is why you would have people who have vitamin D deficiencies have very little melanin in their skin. So therefore they're very fair, which is why they need sunlight. Whereas people who are in excessive sunny areas tend to get darkened skin because they have a lot more melanin developed in the system because there's an overdose of vitamin D in the system. Why is it that most the occurrence of blue eyes and brown eyes and stuff like that has more to do with your diet than anything else? All right. So again, food for thought in terms of leadership, but it then speaks to a lot of other underlying principles that we look at outside there too. All right, so let's move a little bit forward again. And I looked at this kind of closed off the preface area of the chapter about the superficial leader not being able to see the evidence of what is happening around them because they're so taken up by all of the drama that's going on that they're unable to focus and see what's going wrong. Whereas the person who is able to reflect and take his time and look at things will begin to see the processes that they need to be engaged in to be able to get solutions to the problems that they face. So the leader who returns again and again to awareness of process has a deep sense of how things are done and how things happen. And that's important for us because we want to focus our attention on the fact that this program, this course is going to ask us to be doing a lot of self-reflection. And that self-reflection is because the everyday life that we face is full of one piece of activity followed by another and followed by more. And that then leads to situations in which we become so taken up with the everyday rush, we don't really focus our attention on why things are acting or happening the way they are, which is something that we want to be paying attention to. I found that this particular picture here out of that last summit that Trump went to was indicative of that particular thing. This was the point where he was making the decision to step back from the Kyoto Convention and take the U.S. off the signatory list of the thing because he's somebody who doesn't believe in climate change, and these individuals here are trying to convince this gentleman here, and he just simply seems to love this type of nonsense that's happening here, basically. So I felt that this was indicative of that particular situation. This was a very instructive photo I found that came out of that system. And you can see his body language in terms of his arms across the port. This guy seems to be kind of pissed with the Japanese guy, president here. But everybody's leaning over, trying to influence and intimidate him, but he's standing his ground, kind of thing. So quite interesting. Photo speaks a lot of has a lot being said with nothing being said. Don't know if you can see that. All right, so let's take a break for about 10 minutes at this point. Want you all to take a break and kind of take a stretch. We have a couple more. We have a good few slides to go, but I want us to take a little break first so that you can take a stretch. So we'll come back in about 10 minutes. That'll be fine, guys, or you want a little more time? 15 minutes?
10 minutes is fine.
Sorry?
10 minutes is fine.
All right, 10. All right, so tentative, see you all back then. I have 7 o'clock, so we'll be back. I'm going to pause the recording at this point in time and then resume it when we start back, okay?